The rain hit the city like it was trying to erase it. Inside the top floor of a glass tower that belonged to fear more than business, Dante Moretti stood still in front of the window, watching the streets of New York blur into streaks of light. People below rushed like ants, unaware that decisions in rooms like his could rewrite their lives in seconds. Behind him, his men stood silent. They didn't speak unless spoken to. They didn't breathe too loudly unless they wanted to be noticed. And tonight, nobody wanted that. Dante finally turned. "I need a wife by tomorrow," he said calmly. No one reacted at first. Then a faint shift, confusion, disbelief, hesitation. "A real one?" someone finally asked. Dante's eyes narrowed slightly. "Do I look like I'm joking?" He wasn't. A deal was coming, one that required appearances. Stability, family, respectability. The kind of image that softened a man people called a monster. A political merger disguised as legitimacy. And in the world Dante lived in, perception was survival. But marriage? That was just a tool. "Find me someone clean," he added. "No past connections, no debts, no ties to my world." A pause. "And she has to agree, fast." Across town, Lena Carter was folding laundry at her small apartment kitchen table, balancing bills beside her daughter's homework sheets. The heater clicked loudly in the corner, struggling like everything else in her life. Her daughter, Mia, sat cross-legged on the floor, coloring a sun that was too bright for the gray room. "Mom," Mia said softly, "why don't we have a house like the ones in my school book?" Lena smiled without looking up. "Because ours is just waiting for its turn to be better." It was the kind of answer adults learn to give when truth becomes too heavy for children. Her phone buzzed, unknown number. She almost ignored it, but something in her chest told her to answer. "Miss Carter," a voice said, calm and controlled. "You've been selected for a private arrangement." She frowned. "I think you have the wrong person." "No mistake," the voice replied. "You are a single mother, no criminal record, no debts beyond manageable, no ties to organized entities. You meet all requirements." A pause. "We need a wife. By tomorrow." Lena almost laughed. "Is this a joke?" "It is a contract." Something about the word made her stomach tighten. She should have hung up. She should have blocked the number. Instead she said, "Why me?" A pause again. Shorter this time. "Because you have nothing to lose that we can't return." The first time Lena met Dante Moretti, she thought the world had made a mistake. He wasn't just intimidating. He was stillness wrapped around danger, expensive suit, calm expression, eyes that didn't ask for permission to look at you. Maya stood behind her mother's leg, peeking out cautiously. Dante looked at the child first, then at Lena. "You're late," he said. "I wasn't told there was a schedule for being recruited into fake marriages." Lena replied, tightening her grip on her daughter's hand. A flicker, almost amusement, passed through his eyes. "It's not fake," he said, "not publicly." That didn't help. Inside the private office, the air felt heavier. Papers were laid out. A contract. Financial guarantees. Medical coverage. Housing, security, everything a struggling woman would hesitate to refuse, except the part that mattered most: marriage certificate. Public appearance. Shared residence. "Why me?" she asked again, quieter this time. Dante leaned back slightly. "Because you look like someone who won't fall apart under pressure." "That's your reason?" "It's the only one that matters." Maya tugged at Lena's sleeve. "Mom, he's scary." Dante heard her. Instead of reacting, he crouched slightly, lowering himself to Mia's level. "I'm not scary," he said. Maya studied him carefully. "My teacher says scary people always say that." For a moment, something shifted in the room. A few guards behind Dante looked uncomfortable, like the air had changed temperature, but Dante didn't move away. "What's your name?" he asked her. "Mia." "Do you like chocolate?" She nodded slowly. "Then I'm not scary," he said. "Scary people don't share chocolate." Against her will, Lena almost smiled. Almost. The arrangement began the next day, a courthouse signature, cameras, flashing lights. A carefully constructed lie dressed as truth. Smile, Dante murmured as they stood side by side. I didn't agree to be happy about this, Lena whispered back. You agreed to be seen, he replied, and somehow that was worse. The world now called her Mrs. Moretti, a name that opened doors she didn't know existed, and locked others she needed. Days turned into weeks. Lena learned the rules of Dante's world quickly. Don't ask about late-night calls. Don't open doors that were already closed. Don't question men who didn't introduce themselves. But what confused her most wasn't the danger. It was the silence. Dante never raised his voice, never wasted words, never explained more than necessary, yet Mia began laughing more, because Dante, without saying it, started appearing in places he didn't need to be. At breakfast, when Mia struggled with cereal boxes too tall for her, in the garden, when she tried to catch butterflies and fell into grass. Once, late at night, Lena found him sitting in the kitchen alone, staring at a glass of untouched whiskey while Mia's drawings were spread across the table. You don't sleep? She asked. I do, he said, just not much. She stepped closer. Why are you looking at her drawings? She draws the sun wrong. Lena frowned. There's no wrong way to draw the sun. Dante didn't respond immediately, then quietly. She draws it like it stays. That line stayed in the air longer than it should have. The first real crack in the arrangement came unexpectedly. A man from Dante's world appeared at the house when Lena was alone. He didn't knock like someone who expected permission. He looked at her like she was temporary. Boss is getting soft, the man said. I don't know what you're talking about, Lena replied carefully. He didn't used to bring liabilities into his home. The word hit harder than she expected. Before she could respond, the man stepped closer. People like you don't stay in his world long. The door opened before anything else could happen. Dante stood there, still. Silent. The temperature in the room changed instantly. The man straightened. Boss? Dante didn't raise his voice. You're in my house, he said quietly. That was all. The man left within minutes. No argument, no explanation, just obedience. Lena watched from the hallway, realizing something she didn't want to admit. The danger wasn't outside, it was the man who had just protected her. That night, Mia fell asleep early. Lena found Dante standing by the window again. You didn't have to do that, she said. I did. Why? He didn't answer right away then, because I chose this arrangement, so nothing touches it unless I allow it. That's not protection, she said softly. It is in my world. She stepped closer. And what world is that exactly? Dante finally looked at her. For the first time, there was something behind his eyes that wasn't control. Lonely, he said. The word didn't belong to him. Or maybe it did more than anything else. Everything changed the night Mia got sick. High fever, rapid breathing, panic that no amount of money could stabilize. Lena was shaking as she tried to call hospitals. Dante was already moving, no hesitation, no waiting. Within minutes, a private doctor arrived. Equipment, medication, silence turning into controlled urgency. Lena stood in the hallway, watching Dante hold Mia's small hand while the doctor worked. He didn't leave, not once. At one point, Mia opened her eyes slightly. Are you still here? She whispered. Dante nodded. I told you I'm not scary, he said. Mia smiled faintly. You stayed. Something broke in Lena's chest at that moment. Not loudly but completely, because she realized something she hadn't allowed herself to see. This arrangement had started as survival, but somewhere along the way, it had become something else. And Dante Moretti, the man the world feared, hadn't moved an inch from a child's bedside, as if leaving was not an option. He understood. The machines beeped steadily in the quiet room. And outside the window, the city kept moving like nothing had changed. Dante stayed by Mia's bedside through the night while the machines beeped steadily, and Lena sat in a chair too exhausted to even cry properly. watching him like she was seeing a different version of a man the world had warned her about. He didn't move away, didn't delegate, didn't act like he was above the chaos. Instead, he adjusted the blanket on Mia's small body, with a carefulness that felt almost unfamiliar for someone like him. And when the doctor finally said the fever was breaking, Lena exhaled for the first time in hours, but Dante still didn't leave. Just stood by the window again like he always did. Except now the silence between him and Lena felt heavier, more aware, more dangerous in a different way. And when Mia finally slept peacefully, Dante turned slightly and said quietly, "She'll be fine," not as reassurance but as certainty. And Lena found herself asking, "Why are you really doing this without meaning to?" And for the first time he didn't answer immediately, his jaw tightening as if the question had weight he didn't like. Then he said, "Because I know what it feels like to be left when you're vulnerable." And that was all he gave, but it was enough to shift something in the room. Days passed, and Mia recovered quickly under care that money had made immediate. But Dante's presence had made constant, and Lena started noticing things she didn't want to notice, like how the house felt less like a transaction and more like a strange kind of shelter when he was there. How guards lowered their voices around Mia. How food appeared exactly when she forgot to eat. How Dante never asked for gratitude but always showed up anyway. And one evening when Mia was drawing again, she looked up and asked him, "Are you my real dad now?" And the question froze everything because Lena didn't even know she had been thinking it too, until that moment. Dante slowly sat down across from her and said, "No," but then after a pause added, "But I'm here." And Mia accepted that like it was enough while Lena felt something tighten in her chest, because she realized the line between arrangement and reality was starting to blur in ways she couldn't control. Later that night Lena confronted him in the hallway, voice low but shaking slightly. "You're changing things without saying anything," and Dante replied calmly, "I'm not changing anything, I'm just not letting harm reach you." And she stepped closer saying, "That's not what this was supposed to be." And for the first time his expression shifted slightly, almost tired, almost human, and he said, "Nothing in my life stays what it's supposed to be." And before she could respond his phone rang and the atmosphere snapped back into his world again, sharp and cold. He turned away answering in a tone she had never heard from him before, and within seconds, the entire house felt like it was holding its breath, because something outside had finally reached them. Something that wasn't part of the agreement? Something that didn't care about contracts or protection or silence? And as Dante ended the call, he looked back at Lena, and said, "Only one thing, stay inside tonight," and walked out, leaving her standing there realizing for the first time that whatever this arrangement was becoming, it was no longer safe for any of them in the way it used to be. Dante left the house without another word, the sound of his car disappearing into the night like a warning that something irreversible had already started. And Lena stood in the hallway, staring at the closed door long after the silence settled, because something in his voice had been different. Sharper, controlled, but not calm. And Mia was asleep upstairs, unaware that the world around them had just tilted again. Guards outside moved more frequently now, radios murmuring in coded tones Lena couldn't understand. And for the first time she realized Dante's protection wasn't just luxury. It was defense against something real, something dangerous enough to make even him leave without explanation. Hours passed and she tried to distract herself with Mia's sleeping form and the soft hum of the house, but every sound outside made her flinch. Until suddenly a loud crash echoed from the lower floor, followed by shouting that was cut short too quickly. Lena's heart dropped as she grabbed Mia instinctively and hid her in the bedroom closet, whispering for her to stay silent no matter what. Then she stepped into the hallway, just as the lights flickered and went dim, and she heard footsteps that didn't belong to Dante's men. Slow, deliberate, heavy steps moving upstairs. Her breath caught as she backed up slowly until she saw a shadow at the end of the corridor, and a voice called out coldly, "Mrs. Moretti, we know you're here." And before she could react, a second voice added, "Boss should never mixed his world with yours." And Lena realized in that moment this wasn't random, this was targeted. She ran back toward Mia's room, but the hallway filled quickly, and a man grabbed her arm, pulling her back as she struggled desperately, until a sudden sharp sound echoed through the house, and the grip loosened and the man dropped. Behind him, Dante stood at the entrance, covered in rain and fury unlike anything she had ever seen. His presence alone changed the entire room as the intruders froze for half a second before chaos erupted again. But Dante moved like someone who had done this too many times to count, precise, controlled, unstoppable, and within moments the house was silent except for heavy breathing and distant sirens. Lena, still shaking, clutched Mia as Dante approached, slowly checking them both without saying a word, until he finally asked, "Are you hurt?" And she shook her head, unable to speak. Then he looked toward the hallway, filled with unconscious men, and said something into his earpiece that made his men move immediately. And when everything settled again, he stood there longer than usual, as if processing something he didn't like. And Lena finally asked quietly, "Who are they?" And Dante answered with a low voice, "People who think I've become weak." And she realized the truth wasn't just danger outside, it was that she had become part of his weakness in their eyes. And for the first time, Dante looked at her, not like an arrangement, but like a responsibility he couldn't afford to lose. And as Mia clung tighter to Lena's arm, Dante added softly, "This is going to get worse before it gets better." And the weight of those words made it clear that whatever fragile safety they had was now gone completely. The morning after the attack, the house didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a secured bunker held together by fear and silence. Broken furniture still lay in the hallway. Faint stains of the night before had been cleaned too quickly to pretend nothing happened. And Mia stayed close to Lena, refusing to go downstairs while Dante sat in a room filled with men, reviewing reports that sounded more like war than business. Every word exchanged carried weight. Names, locations, betrayals. Something deeper had been exposed, and now it was spreading. And when Dante finally walked into the kitchen, his presence was heavier than before, like he hadn't slept at all. His eyes briefly moved to Mia, then to Lena, and for a moment he looked like he wanted to say something normal. But instead he simply said, "We moved today." And Lena immediately understood. This wasn't a suggestion, it was instruction. Guards began packing essential items, cars were brought to the front, and within an hour the house they had lived in felt abandoned, like it had never belonged to them. Mia held Lena's hand tightly as they were escorted outside, and she looked back at the house, confused, asking, "Are we coming back?" But no one answered. Dante personally checked the surroundings before letting them into an armored vehicle, and sat across from them, instead of his usual separate car, which made Lena uneasy, because it meant danger was closer than ever. The drive was silent except for encrypted communication from his team, and occasional glances Dante gave toward the windows, like he expected something to appear at any moment. Halfway through the route, the convoy slowed suddenly, and Dante's expression changed instantly as he looked at the screen in his hand, then said one word, "Ambush." Before everything erupted into motion, tires screeched, glass shattered, and Lena pulled Mia down just as bullets struck the vehicle's exterior. Dante didn't panic. He moved fast, covering them both while issuing commands through his earpiece, and the convoy split in different directions to confuse the attackers. The world outside became chaos. Sirens, smoke, shouting, but inside the vehicle Dante stayed focused, shielding Lena and Mia with his body when needed without hesitation. and in one sharp moment, the vehicle took a hard turn, throwing everyone slightly off balance, and Dante grabbed Lena's arm, steadying her without thinking. Their eyes met for a brief second in the middle of chaos, and she saw something she hadn't seen before: not control but concern, not strategy but fear, not for himself but for them. And when the gunfire finally faded, and the convoy regrouped at a hidden location, Dante stepped out first, scanning the area before helping them out. Mia was crying quietly now, and Lena held her close, while Dante stood slightly apart, speaking to his men with controlled urgency. But when he turned back, his voice softened just a little as he said, "This place is temporary. Nowhere is safe anymore." And Lena realized they were no longer just part of his world, they were now the target inside it. And whatever line had once separated arrangement from reality had completely disappeared. The temporary safe house was hidden deep outside the city, surrounded by forest and guarded checkpoints. But even there nothing felt safe anymore, because fear had followed them like a shadow that refused to leave. Mia barely left Lena's side, and every small sound made her flinch, while Dante worked non-stop in a room filled with maps, surveillance screens, and names that kept changing as new threats were discovered. He looked more exhausted than Lena had ever seen him, but he never stopped moving, never stopped calculating, and every so often his eyes would drift toward the door, as if checking without meaning to if they were still there. One night Lena walked in quietly holding a glass of water and placed it near him, saying, "You haven't slept." And he replied, without looking up, "Sleep can wait." And she said softly, "People can't." And that made him pause for a second longer than usual. Outside the room, Mia was sleeping but restless, calling out in her sleep, and Lena knew the trauma was settling in, even if she tried to hide it during the day. Later that night, the power flickered, and alarms briefly activated, causing instant tension across the entire house. Guards rushed to positions while Dante checked systems, but it turned out to be a false signal triggered from outside interference. Yet it was enough to remind everyone that they were being watched constantly. And when everything settled, Dante finally stepped outside onto the balcony, where Lena was already standing. And for a long moment neither of them spoke. The wind was cold and distant lights from the forest barely visible. Then Lena said, "This isn't living anymore," and Dante replied, "I know." And for the first time there was no defense in his voice, only acceptance. She turned toward him and asked, "How long will this continue?" And he said quietly, "Until I end it." And she looked at him, searching for certainty, but found only responsibility and pressure that no one should carry alone. Then after a pause she asked something she had been holding back for days, "Why did you choose me, really?" And this time Dante didn't avoid it. He looked at her fully and said, "Because you didn't look like someone who would survive this world. But you did anyway." And that answer stayed between them heavier than any confession. Inside the house, Mia's voice called out for Lena, and she rushed back in, but Dante remained outside longer, standing still as if the weight of everything was finally starting to reach him. And somewhere in the distance, a vehicle passed too slowly for comfort, reminding them that even silence outside could no longer be trusted. The next morning brought news that changed everything again. One of Dante's closest insiders had been found dead, under circumstances that couldn't be explained as an accident. And the moment Dante read the report, his entire expression hardened in a way Lena hadn't seen before, because this wasn't just an attack, it was betrayal from inside his own circle. Security was immediately tightened further, and every person in the safe house was rechecked. While Mia stayed in a locked room with Lena, as tension spread through every corner of the building, Dante ordered silence across all channels for a short time, as he traced communication leaks, and what he discovered made the situation worse. Someone had been feeding information about their movements for weeks, which meant every place they had been was already compromised at some level. Lena overheard parts of the conversation, and realized with growing dread that the attack in the convoy wasn't random at all, but coordinated from within. That night Dante finally called everyone into one room and said, "We don't trust anyone anymore," and that sentence changed the entire atmosphere because it meant even allies were now suspects. Guards who had worked with him for years now avoided eye contact, and Lena saw the cost of his world more clearly than ever. Later, when everything was quiet, Mia asked Lena if they were in danger, and Lena hesitated before answering honestly, "Yes, but we are together," and hugged her tighter because it was the only truth she could give. Meanwhile, Dante stood alone, reviewing files until Lena walked in and said, "You can't carry all of this alone," and he replied, "I already am." And she stepped closer saying, "That's not strength, that's punishment," and for a moment something flickered in his expression like he wanted to disagree but couldn't. Then suddenly an alert sounded from the control room, and Dante immediately turned alert again, while Lena instinctively moved toward Mia. But this time Dante stopped her gently saying, "Stay here," and she looked at him differently now, not just as the man who arranged a contract, but as someone standing at the edge of losing everything. And as he walked away into the corridor filled with flashing monitors and urgent voices, Lena realized the real war was no longer outside their doors, it was inside his life. And whatever truth was coming next would finally decide whether they survived this, or were destroyed by it completely. The alert turned out to be worse than anyone expected, because it wasn't a simple breach attempt. It was a signal from one of Dante's own communication nodes being activated without authorization, meaning someone inside his remaining circle was still feeding information. And Dante's patience finally snapped in a controlled but terrifying way as he locked down the entire facility, and ordered every channel traced at once. The safe house transformed into a command center within minutes, with guards running, screens flashing, and encrypted lines being cross-checked in real time. Lena stayed with Mia, but she could feel the shift in energy, like the air itself had become sharper, heavier, and more dangerous. Then suddenly, Dante returned with two of his men and said, "Pack only what you need. We leave now," and there was no discussion this time, because the threat was no longer theoretical, it was closing in fast. They moved within minutes into a convoy again, but this time route details were constantly changing mid-drive, as Dante personally rerouted them to avoid predicted interception points. Lena noticed how tightly he was holding control of everything, but also how exhausted he looked, like he hadn't fully recovered from the previous attacks. Halfway through the journey, Dante received a private encrypted call, and his face changed immediately as he ended it, and said only one word, "Found." And that was enough to make everyone tense, because it meant the traitor had been identified. But instead of relief there was urgency, because the traitor was still in motion, and trying to escape with critical information. The convoy diverted sharply toward an unknown location, and Lena held Mia close as the vehicle accelerated. When they arrived at a secluded industrial area, Dante stepped out first, and everything went silent for a moment before distant shouting and movement confirmed someone was already there. A confrontation unfolded off-screen, but the sound of it reached them clearly enough to make Lena realize Dante had finally confronted the source of betrayal directly. And when he returned moments later, his expression was unreadable, but the silence around him said everything had already been decided. Mia asked quietly if everything was okay, and Dante looked at her for a second longer than usual before saying, "Yes, it's over." But Lena could tell from his eyes that nothing about this was truly over yet. And as they left the area behind, she understood the most dangerous part wasn't the enemies they could see. It was the ones that had already been close enough to touch them. And now even that layer of trust inside Dante's world had completely collapsed, leaving only uncertainty ahead. After the confrontation at the industrial site, The convoy didn't return to any safe house, because Dante no longer trusted any fixed location. Instead, they kept moving through a chain of secured routes, while his men worked non-stop to rebuild their network from scratch. And Lena noticed how even the strongest people around him were now quieter, more cautious. Like everyone was afraid of saying the wrong name out loud. Dante stayed in the lead vehicle this time, constantly communicating, constantly adjusting. But every time his eyes drifted toward Lena and Mia, there was something heavier in his expression, like he was carrying a decision he hadn't shared yet. That night they stopped briefly in a secured underground facility, and Mia finally fell asleep properly for the first time in days, while Lena stepped into a separate room and found Dante standing alone again, staring at a wall covered in names and connections. She asked him softly, "What happens now?" And he didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "Now it ends properly," and she understood that meant something bigger was coming, something final. She stepped closer and said, "You don't have to do everything alone," and he replied, "If I don't, people die," and that silence after his words felt heavier than anything before. Later, one of his remaining trusted men arrived with information that confirmed the identity of the real mastermind behind the internal betrayal, someone far higher than anyone expected, someone who had been close to Dante for years, and for the first time Lena saw something in him crack. Not fear exactly, but realization that this wasn't just a war anymore, it was personal on a level that couldn't be reversed. Mia woke up briefly calling for Lena, and when she went to her, Dante followed quietly and stood at the doorway, watching without interrupting. And in that moment Lena realized he wasn't just protecting them anymore, he was attached to them in a way that made leaving impossible for him too. But that attachment was also what made them the easiest way to hurt him. And as the night deepened and alarms stayed silent, for once there was no peace in it, only the calm before something everyone could feel coming, but no one could stop. The calm didn't last, because early the next morning, Dante received confirmation that the mastermind had already begun moving assets and preparing a final strike designed to wipe out everything tied to him in one coordinated collapse. And this time Dante didn't rush, he became extremely quiet, almost colder than before, as if he had accepted that the situation had reached its final stage. He called his remaining trusted circle, and gave instructions that sounded less like defense, and more like preparation for ending something permanently. Lena noticed the change immediately, and when she asked him, "What are you planning?" he simply said, "Fixing what I should have fixed long ago," and she felt a chill, because she realized he was no longer just reacting, he was deciding the outcome. Mia stayed close to Lena, sensing the tension without understanding it. And for the first time Dante asked Lena something unexpected. "If this ends badly, I want you to leave immediately with her." And she stared at him, shocked, saying, "I'm not leaving you here." And he replied, "You don't get to choose this part." But there was something in his voice that wasn't command, it was concern. Later the facility went into full lockdown, after movement was detected near one of the outer zones, and Dante moved with his team into position, while Lena and Mia were placed in a reinforced safe room. But before the doors closed, Dante stopped for a moment and looked at them both, like he was memorizing something he might not see again. Mia asked him softly, "Will you come back?" And for a brief second he couldn't answer quickly. Then he said yes, but it sounded like a promise he was fighting to believe himself. After the doors sealed, Lena stood in silence, holding Mia as distant sounds of preparation echoed through the structure. And she finally understood that whatever Dante Moretti was about to face wasn't just another conflict, it was the end of everything he had built, and possibly the end of the man himself. While outside the world of his enemies was already closing in for the final move, and there was no longer any place left to run. The final attack began, without warning, as the entire facility shook from a coordinated breach on multiple sides and alarms erupted through every corridor, while Dante's men engaged instantly in a controlled but desperate defense. Lena and Mia remained locked inside the reinforced safe room, but the sounds outside made it clear, this was not a small fight, it was a full collapse of everything Dante had been preparing for. Lena held Mia tightly as the lights flickered and emergency systems switched on, and through the intercom she heard Dante's voice for the first time in hours, calm but sharp, giving final orders to fall back and seal sections to contain the breach. But then something unexpected happened. The communication cut for a few seconds, and when it returned, Dante's voice was closer, more urgent. As he said, "They're inside the lower level." And Lena's heart dropped, because it meant the fight had reached them. Mia started crying quietly, and Lena tried to stay calm, but even she could feel the structure changing around them. Then suddenly the door controls sparked and began failing, as someone attempted manual override from outside, and Lena realized they didn't have much time left. Outside, Dante moved through smoke and chaos, taking down threats with precision, but it was clear he was being pushed back for the first time, because the enemy had anticipated his every move. And in one moment, he received a direct message from the mastermind, offering a deal that would end everything if he surrendered control of his entire network. Dante didn't respond immediately, but instead, looked toward the direction of the safe room, and for the first time hesitation crossed his face. Because what was being taken from him now wasn't power or territory, it was the people inside that room. Lena heard footsteps approaching outside the door, and pulled Mia behind her as the locking mechanism started to fail. And at that exact moment, Dante arrived at the corridor entrance, covered in smoke and blood but still standing. And when he saw the door being forced open, something in him finally broke, and he moved forward with a level of determination that changed everything in the room. The attackers hesitated for the first time as he said quietly, "Enough," and the word carried more weight than any weapon, but the outcome of that moment was still uncertain. As the final confrontation between Dante and the mastermind was now directly in motion, and everything depended on what would happen in the next few seconds inside that collapsing world. The corridor outside the safe room turned into complete chaos as Dante finally reached the point where there was no more strategy left, only instinct and determination. And the attackers who had once been confident now hesitated, because something about his presence had shifted into something far more dangerous than before. Lena could hear metal breaking, footsteps rushing, and shouted commands cutting through the smoke, while Mia pressed tightly against her mother, unable to understand but fully sensing danger. Then suddenly the door lock sparked again, and gave way halfway, leaving only a thin barrier between them and everything outside. Dante stepped directly into view of the remaining attackers, and for a moment everything slowed as if the entire structure was holding its breath. And then he spoke again quietly, but with absolute finality, "Leave now and you live." And this time no one responded because they knew he was no longer negotiating, he was ending it. A brief but intense confrontation followed off-screen in the smoke-filled corridor, as Dante faced the last wave directly, while his remaining men secured the exits. And Lena could only hear fragments of movement and impact, until suddenly everything went silent for a second that felt longer than anything before. Then the emergency lights stabilized slightly, and the safe room door finally unlocked from the outside. Lena pushed it open with shaking hands and stepped out holding Mia, as she saw the aftermath of the breach, corridor damaged, systems failing, and Dante standing at the center still upright but visibly exhausted. And when he turned toward them for the first time, his expression softened, not as a mafia boss or strategist, but as someone who had carried too much for too long. Mia ran toward him without hesitation and hugged him tightly, which made even his rigid posture break slightly, as he placed a hand gently on her back. Lena stood frozen for a moment, realizing that everything had changed in ways that couldn't be undone, and Dante finally said quietly, "It's over now." But the silence that followed suggested the cost of over was far greater than anyone had expected. And as sirens approached in the distance, and dawn began to break through the broken structure, it became clear that whatever came next would no longer belong to the world they had been running from, but to whatever was left after it. The first light of dawn revealed the full damage of the night, as emergency teams and distant sirens began surrounding the collapsed perimeter of Dante's facility. But inside the structure, everything felt strangely still, like the world had finally exhaled after holding its breath for too long. Lena stood close to Mia while Dante coordinated the last remaining movements of his men, ensuring no further threats remained, and every exit was secured, but his body language had changed completely now, slower, heavier, like the weight he had carried for years had finally started to settle on him at once. When everything was confirmed safe, his men approached him for final reports. But he dismissed them quietly, saying, "Stand down," which was something they had rarely heard from him in that tone. Mia stayed near him, refusing to let go of his hand, even as chaos turned into calm, and Lena watched this silently, realizing that the version of Dante she had first met no longer existed in the same way. Later, as emergency personnel began entering the outer sections, Dante guided Lena and Mia toward a secured exit route away from the destruction, and for the first time in days there were no immediate threats, no alarms, no urgency, just broken silence and cold air, but that silence carried its own weight, because everything they had survived had permanently changed them. When they reached a quieter, safe zone outside the structure, Lena finally asked him, "What happens to us now?" And Dante looked at her for a long moment before answering, "Now you are free." But his eyes didn't match the words fully. Mia asked softly if they would still stay together, and Dante knelt slightly to her level and said, "I will always be here when you need me," which made her smile, even though Lena felt a deep uncertainty behind it. As authorities and outside forces began to take control of the situation, Dante stepped back slightly, realizing his world was now officially collapsing into consequences. Lena watched him carefully, and for the first time saw not a mafia boss or a protector, but a man standing at the edge of everything he had built and lost. And as the sun rose fully over the damaged horizon, it became clear that their story was no longer about survival alone, but about what remains when survival finally ends, and real life begins again in the quiet aftermath. As the morning settled and emergency crews secured the area, Dante was taken aside for questioning by authorities, who had finally arrived to assess the aftermath of the collapse. But unlike before, he didn't resist or control the situation this time. He simply complied with a calm exhaustion that made him look less like a feared figure, and more like someone who had already finished fighting everything he needed to. Lena stayed with Mia, outside the secured perimeter, watching him from a distance as officers spoke with him, and for the first time she saw how differently the world treated him when power was removed from the equation. No longer a boss, no longer untouchable, just a man under scrutiny. After some time he was allowed a brief moment before being transferred for further process, and he walked toward Lena and Mia slowly, as if each step carried the weight of everything that had happened. Mia immediately reached for him again, and he gently held her hand. Then he looked at Lena and said quietly, "This is where it ends for me," and she understood he wasn't speaking about just the night but about everything he had built. She asked him, "What will you do now?" And he replied, "Face whatever comes next," but there was no fear in it, only acceptance. Lena hesitated before saying, "You saved us," and Dante shook his head slightly, saying, "No, you both reminded me there was something left to save in myself." That moment stayed between them longer than words usually did, because it wasn't a confession or goodbye but something in between. Soon officers signaled that he had to leave, and as he was escorted away, Mia suddenly hugged him tightly, refusing to let go for a moment, until he softly placed a hand on her head and said, "Be brave, okay?" And she nodded with tears in her eyes. Lena watched him being taken away, knowing this was the final time their lives would overlap in the same way. And as his figure disappeared behind the vehicles and flashing lights, she realized that everything they had gone through had reshaped them all in ways that couldn't be reversed, leaving only silence, distance, and the uncertain beginning of whatever life would look like after him. After Dante was taken away, the world didn't instantly feel peaceful. It felt empty in a way that made everything they survived suddenly hit harder. Because now there was no urgency left to distract from reality. Lena and Mia were relocated to a protected civilian facility, where families affected by the operation were being temporarily housed. And for the first time in days, there were no alarms, no guards rushing, no encrypted voices in the background, just silence and unfamiliar normality. Mia struggled to adjust at first, asking repeatedly where Dante was and why he didn't come back with them, and Lena had no answer that didn't hurt. Days passed slowly as investigations continued, and news reports began circulating about the collapse of a major criminal network tied to Dante's empire. Though nothing was said directly about him beyond speculation and legal proceedings, Lena avoided watching most of it, but couldn't escape the weight of what it meant. One afternoon she received a sealed letter, delivered by one of Dante's remaining trusted men, who had quietly stepped away from his world, and inside was a simple message from Dante written before his transfer. It said only that he hoped they would be safe, and that for the first time in a long time, his choices had led to something that wasn't destruction. Mia kept the letter close after reading it once, because it made her feel like he was still somehow near, and Lena realized that, even though his presence had disappeared from their daily life, the impact of what he had done for them remained everywhere. Slowly the days began to stabilize, routines forming again, small moments of normal life returning like fragile pieces being rebuilt. But Lena often found herself thinking back to the way he stood in the chaos, not as a monster or a myth, but as a man who had finally reached the end of everything he was running from. And as time moved forward, she understood that some people don't stay in your life to remain forever. Sometimes they arrive only to change the direction of it completely, before disappearing into whatever consequences they must face alone. Weeks passed after Dante's transfer, and life, for Lena and Mia, slowly began to rebuild into something quieter and more stable, though normal still felt unfamiliar after everything they had survived. The facility eventually arranged their transition into a small apartment under protection, where they could finally live without constant surveillance and fear, and for the first time, Mia started going outside again, holding Lena's hand tightly but smiling at small things like sunlight on trees and children playing in distant parks. Lena watched her carefully, because healing didn't happen all at once. It came in small moments like this, but even in this calmer life, Dante never fully disappeared from their thoughts, especially Mia's, who would sometimes ask if he was still alone, or if he remembered her drawings. Lena always answered gently without fully knowing the truth herself. One evening, while unpacking their remaining belongings, Lena found something she hadn't seen before tucked inside one of the bags they had carried from the safe house. It was a small folded note and a simple photo Mia had drawn for Dante with the sun and 3 figures holding hands, and on the back of it was a short handwritten line from him that said, "You made me remember what staying feels like." Lena sat with that for a long time, because it didn't feel like goodbye or closure. It felt like something paused rather than ended. Months continued to pass, and official news confirmed legal proceedings around Dante's case were ongoing, with his empire fully dismantled and his influence erased from the city. But no detailed updates about his personal outcome were ever made public, and life continued to move forward anyway, as it always does. Lena eventually returned to simple work and rebuilding stability for Mia, but she often noticed how Mia still looked at strangers longer than usual, as if searching for a familiar presence. And one quiet evening, as the city lights softened outside their window, Mia asked again, "Do you think he's okay?" And Lena paused before answering honestly, "I think he did what he had to do. And sometimes people like that don't come back the same." And in that silence between them there was no sadness anymore, just understanding, because what Dante had been to their lives was not something that could be replaced or repeated. It was something that had existed for a moment in time and changed everything it touched, before fading into the distance of consequences and memory. Months later, life had finally settled into something that resembled peace. Even if the memory of everything they lived through still lingered in quiet moments, Lena had built a small but steady routine for herself and Mia had slowly started smiling more freely again, laughing at school, drawing again, and asking fewer questions about the past as time softened the sharp edges of their story. But Lena knew some things never fully disappear, they just change shape inside you. One winter evening, while returning home from work, Lena noticed a sealed envelope waiting at their apartment door with no sender name. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked it up, because something about it felt familiar in a way she couldn't explain. Inside was a simple note written in Dante's handwriting, the same calm, controlled style but softer now. It said only a few lines. "If you are reading this, then I am no longer part of your world. I wanted to make sure you had a life where my name no longer brought fear. Thank you for reminding me that not everything I built had to end in darkness." There was no request, no expectation, just closure. Lena sat by the window holding the letter as city lights flickered outside, and for the first time she didn't feel fear or confusion, only acceptance. Mia came and sat beside her quietly and asked if it was from him. Lena nodded, and Mia smiled softly as if she already understood. And that night they didn't talk much because they didn't need to. The past had finally stopped chasing them, not because it was forgotten but because it had completed its course, somewhere far away. Dante Moretti remained only as a name in old reports and fading headlines, but in the life he had briefly entered, something had changed permanently, not through power or violence, but through the rare moments where even someone like him chose to protect rather than destroy. And in the quiet, ordinary days that followed, Lena finally understood that some people don't stay forever to be part of your life. They arrive, change its direction completely, and then leave behind a version of you that can finally live without them. And as the night deepened and Mia fell asleep peacefully, for the first time in a long while, Lena closed the letter, turned off the light, and let the silence feel like the end of a long story that no longer needed continuation. Please subscribe to my channel, share my video, like it, and comment. Your support means a lot to me.